How can you bring a flat image back to life? Despite our best efforts to shoot images at dramatic times of day, a raw photo often comes out looking dull and lifeless. And unfortunately, global adjustments like exposure, contrast, and color temperature won't necessarily fix the issue. That's because dramatic scenes with dramatic lighting are made of large contrasting regions of lights and darks. Since bumping global exposure or contrast affects all these areas equally, it fails to produce contrasting regions. But in post-production, we can apply our intuitions about dramatic lighting to artificially introduce contrasting regions with dodging and burning, or as I prefer to call it, light painting. You've probably heard of light painting as it refers to the night photography technique of moving a light source through a scene during a long exposure. But when I first started landscape photography, it struck me that we often want to do exactly the same thing in post-production. That is, we want to start out with a dark scene and use light to paint in the areas of interest. It's not just dull, flat photos that benefit. In fact, your better images will benefit the most from some light painting because you don't need to invent contrasting regions, you only need to bring out what's already there. Let's walk through 5 steps that you can take to light paint an image. I'll be using the street shot of an Italian village. I snapped this on an overcast afternoon a few years ago, so the quality and the color of the light weren't great. However, I was drawn to the color palette of the houses and cars, and with a little light painting, we can try to bring these elements out. Our final result will look like this. To get here, our first question should be, what should we dodge and what should we burn? Let's first identify composition, shapes, and lighting. So if I do our little rule of thirds grid here, this image doesn't have an incredibly compelling composition, but we do see that most of the action happens in this center region. We have the buildings, we have the cars, we also have some archways here, which could be interesting. The main thing that drew me to this image, however, was the color of these buildings, these beautiful yellows and pinks back here, and then the 2 cars. So those are the main elements that stand out to me, as does this lamp. So there's our composition, fairly simple, not a lot going on the rule of thirds, but there are some elements in this photo. Next, we want to identify the shapes. This image doesn't have too much in the way of shapes, but it does have this arc coming down from the sky, which follows the contour of these roofs. Furthermore, we have the repeated arch shape over here on the sides. And although it's not necessarily a shape, notice that we have very strong leading lines from the sides of the street to help draw the eye in towards the main subject, being the cars and these houses back here. So with that in mind, we do have some shapes in this image to help guide the viewer. As far as lighting goes, our main light source is up here, but that's not where most of the interest is. So I would say that our secondary light source is these houses back here. Unfortunately, if we turn this upside down, we'll notice that there's actually a third light source, and it's one of the brighter regions, and it's this street in the foreground. Now, the street was not an important component of the composition and shapes. However, it is well lit, which means it's drawing a lot of attention unnecessarily. Since we've identified it, we now know that during our light painting, we need to do exactly the reverse. We need to darken it so that way it stands out less. Now that we've identified the key elements in this image, we need to start out with a dark and cool canvas. This is one of my favorite ways to start editing a photo. I'll just make everything very cold and very dark. So I'm going to make this cool. I'm going to go with about 5700 Kelvin. Let me add a little bit of pink here. And I'm going to darken it just a little, but not too much. And I'll bring down the highlights so that way we can start to see a little bit more detail in the sky. Now, if you take a look at the histogram up here, you'll notice it's incredibly dark right now. We would never ship an image like this. However, now we can focus on just bringing out regions. The next part of step 2 is we need to identify those regions which are distracting us and try to darken them more so that way they take less precedence in the image. I love to pull out the neutral density filter for these kinds of adjustments so that way I don't get too specific with local adjustments. So I'm going to bring this down quite a bit. Since it is a street and it's not a compelling part of the composition, it's not too noticeable. So I'm going to darken it quite a bit. I'm also going to take the sides here, which has this gutter that's kind of distracting. I'm going to do a neutral density filter here just to darken that a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing here just to get the side of the building. That's a little bit too extreme. Let me walk that back down. I'll do that on both sides. So if we look at the thumbnail view, you'll now notice that the focus is going to be a little bit more on the middle region, and less on the street and the sides of the walls. It's a little bit crude at this point, but again, we want to think in terms of global adjustments first and just trying to get everything dark and cool. Speaking of cool, I want to cool the sides of this and the street by about 10 degrees Kelvin on all the sides, just to make it a little bit cooler. So cools tend to recede, meaning they don't receive prominence and the viewer's eye doesn't tend to wander towards them, whereas warms tend to pop forward. So it's not just lights and darks that help communicate depth and prominence in an image, it's also coolness and warms. Now just to double check, I'm going to turn this upside down, and what I now notice is that the street doesn't take up nearly as much attention, which is good. However, the sky is still taking a little too much attention, especially near the top here. So I'm going to go ahead and do a neutral density filter up here, darken it a little bit, but mostly I'll bring down the highlights. I don't want to bring down the exposure too much, or else that's going to darken the roof line too much. So in fact, I'll bring the exposure back up a little bit. So now if I turn it upside down, the eye doesn't tend to wander outside the image quite as much. I might have to come back and revisit that. So that's step 2. We've darkened everything, especially the things that shouldn't be important, and we've cooled it down. Now what remains is to start bringing out the important elements in the image using warms and using exposure. I recommend starting with global adjustments and then working way to slightly smaller brushes. If you go for the small brushes too quickly, you're going to end up painting in a lot of very fine detail, which becomes very unforgiving. If you just start with very large brushes, especially things like the radial filter, which is my personal favorite, you're going to be working with very large details in very large regions, so it's not going to be too difficult to make something that's believable. So of course, our main source of interest here was the buildings with the car. I don't want to lighten the sky too much, so I'm going to do a small radial filter, and I'm going to lighten this and warm it up. So I'm going to bump this up maybe about 0.5, and I'll warm it up 10 degrees Kelvin. That's already looking pretty awesome. Let me throw a little bit of pink on that just to bring out the magenta. Right now this image is overall very dark, which gives us a little bit more to work with. I'm going to go ahead and start painting in some of the other details we identified. Remember that we said that the cars, the roof line, and also these arches were interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out my brush, and I'm going to do exposure. I'm also going to bump up the warmth by 5 degrees Kelvin. So I want to paint in just the sides of these houses. So I'm going to lighten them a little bit with some warmth. I'm also going to bump up the saturation a little bit. There's a lot of beautiful color in the sides of these buildings, so let's bump that up. I'm going to create a separate brush for the cars here in the foreground. That way we can bump up the whites a little bit for the reflections in the windshield. And now for those arches, we'll bump up the exposure, and let me also paint it in on the other side. This is about as small as I want to get with this brush. To wrap this up, I'm also going to lighten up just the side of the road a little bit to help draw your eye to these doorways. Now we talked about the leading lines and the shapes throughout this image. You may notice that there's a very faint line here in the foreground, so I'm just going to paint that in a little bit more. Now as a thumbnail that can look a little bit extreme, so you might have to come back and dial this back a little bit. I may redo those and I'll do it with a much more subtle 0.3 exposure instead, so that way I have a little bit more fine control. So already we have a huge difference. If I flip back to what we had, there's a lot more focus on the direction and the different subjects in this image. Step 4 is to identify the source of natural light and to imitate its direction. Since this is an overcast day, it's a very flat light source, but I like to imagine that the light is coming in at an angle about like this. So I want to enhance that a little bit. I'm going to pull out my neutral density filter again, and I want to darken the sides, 0.3 on the exposure, and let's cool it a little bit. And I'm going to put it up here on the top, and I'm going to make sort of a spotlight effect just on the sides to enhance this structure a little bit more. We're almost done. Step 5, which I've got a little bit of a head start on, is now starting to work on those local adjustments and focus in on fine-tuning the subjects in the image. So I would probably come back here to the arch and do a little bit more work on it. It still isn't quite as powerful as I'd like it to be, so I'm going to paint that in just a little bit more and warm it up. Let's not warm it up too much. Let's maybe do 3. And I'll do it on this arch a little bit as well. It's already glowing, so I'll just give it just a little bit more on the side. And then also, I want to come back up here to this lamp. We could stand to highlight it, so I'm going to paint that in a little bit. To finish this off, I feel like we need just a little bit more contrast between the lights and the dark, so I'm going to pull out my radial filter one last time. You could always adjust the one you already have, but very often I find stacking them helps me keep the different purposes of these different filters separate from each other. So I'm going to do an elliptical filter, and I'm going to rotate it a little bit just to keep things from being too much of the same shape. Make it a little narrower. And I'm going to warm up the part inside. And in addition to throwing some exposure on here, I'm also going to add a little bit of contrast. We haven't been doing too much contrast in these settings, but I feel like to make this region really pop, we need some good darks and lights within the main region. So if I flip back and forth between before and after, you'll see that it's got just a little bit more pow to it. I'm going to bump up the whites just a little bit as well, and we'll bump up exposure yet again. Sometimes it takes several layers before you can get all the effects right. Of course, you can reuse these brushes, but I prefer to just keep adding brushes so that way each brush can have a different purpose. You could do so much more on this image, but in a matter of minutes, we've come quite a ways. Here's what it was before, and here's after. Light painting is a powerful way to guide your viewer's eye to the important elements in a landscape. And although today's example was a bit extreme, I find myself using light painting to the most success in images that are already exceptional straight out of the camera. But by mastering light painting in these extreme situations, you'll be better equipped to introduce it in much smaller doses to your portfolio images. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for the latest digital nomad tips and landscape photography tutorials.